Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that don't know me by now, my name is Sarah Hunak and I'm the current chair of the SRP Webinar Working Group. Thank you for joining us today for our lunchtime webinar on Measuring the Invisible, Activity Assessment of Radioactive Waste, which all sounds very exciting. We've got over 440 people registered for this webinar today. Excellent turnout, Steph. So thank you all for joining us and keeping up the success of these webinars. Next, just a couple of ground rules. Apologies if you've heard them all before, but do pay attention today as they might just be a little bit different this time. So firstly, questions. You can ask questions at any point through the Q&A box. You should see a question mark inside a speech bubble on your screen. So click on that and ask questions at any point as we go along. You can also like any questions that are published in there if you'd like to know the answer to it as well. And the most liked ones will be the ones that we put to Steph at the end of the presentation. And as always, any that we don't get time to answer today are going to be posted to our events page. In terms of registering your attendance and being able to claim CPD points, here's where we check that you've been paying attention. This time, please email Mo. Her email along with the code are on the screen now, and they'll also be in the Q&A box during the talk for you to jot down if you need to. And finally, as always, please give us your feedback so we can keep improving these webinar sessions. The feedback form will be sent to you after the talk. So coming up next in the webinar series, we've got a talk in a couple of weeks on radiological risk assessment, so hopefully we'll see you there. So whilst you're here, again, I have to plug membership just in case you're not already a member. Benefits include the Society Journal and a weekly e-newsletter. You get discounted attendance at conferences and full-day virtual events. It'll help keep you up to date with the RP community, get access to job vacancies and get involved with committees within the Society. And finally, we offer professional status. So we currently offer these 3 grades of professional membership. Check out our YouTube channel to find out more about what they are and how you can apply for them, and stay tuned for a webinar on this topic too. So if you do fancy joining, then just head over to our website after the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Bloomer from URENCO. Stephanie has a PhD in physics and computer modelling. Her background is in health physics, simulation, modelling and the manipulation of data. Stephanie has 12 years nuclear industry experience and is an accredited radioactive waste advisor. In her role for URENCO Nuclear Stewardship, Stephanie provides advice to the Capenhurst site on matters concerning characterisation of radioactive waste, of land and of building structures. She leads on the procedures for clearance and exemption of wastes and materials. She also provides oversight and technical support for all waste assay systems at URENCO Nuclear Stewardship and sings a tragic but beautiful song on the ukulele about lost particles in microshield. So it may be April 1st, but this more ain't no fool. Over to you, Steph.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think look out for me coming on the Capenhurst doing a little music festival as well. So what Sarah doesn't know is that I'm also doing a little song on the Capenhurst Music Festival. Right, stand by while I share my slides. Okay, I'm assuming you can see those now. Yeah, as Sarah says, I lead on characterisation of radioactive waste for URENCO Nuclear Stewardship. And today we're talking about, I've called it Measuring the Invisible. Thought that sounded slightly more interesting or more glamorous than activity assessment of radioactive waste. Somebody let me know if the slides aren't working. I'm going to assume they are unless I hear it otherwise. What we'll be talking about today is I'm going to give a real brief introduction to who URENCO Nuclear Stewardship are. And then this talk will be an introduction because we've only got a limited amount of time. Limited introduction for those who are not familiar with activity assessment of radioactive waste. So we'll look at why you might want to know the activity of your waste. We're going to have a little quick look at what fingerprints are, because that's quite fundamental to the activity assessments. And we're going to then look at different methods that you can use for activity assessment of radioactive waste. And along the way, I'm going to highlight some potential pitfalls and error traps for a bit of learning from experience. What we're not going to talk about today is the quantification of emissions and discharges. So the radioactive waste I'm talking about today is more like solid or liquid but packaged radioactive waste going off site for disposal. Or as Sarah said, characterisation of wastes before they've been packaged, but not emissions and discharges. And we're also not going to talk about estimating activity based on just pure calculation and modelling. All of these methods today discuss the actual measurement of radioactivity as part of the method. So URENCO nuclear stewardship provides a number of different services there highlighted on the bottom left. So we do radioactive waste services, storage of nuclear material, decommissioning and land remediation, and engineering support. And there's some further information on the slide there that I'll let you take in. And URENCO nuclear stewardship fits as part of the wider URENCO group. So on Capenhurst site, there are 3 nuclear licensed companies. There's one nuclear licensed company, 3 separate companies: URENCO Nuclear Stewardship, URENCO UK, and URENCO Chem Plants. And I work for URENCO Nuclear Stewardship there. But they're also part of the wider URENCO group who provide enrichment. They've got the U battery as part of providing energy going forward, and they've got the stable isotopes business, which looks at generating isotopes for medical and industrial applications. Okay, so if we get into the body of the talk, so the first question that you might be asking is, why do you need to do an activity assessment? This is my face when people turn to me and say, but we're sending it as radioactive, aren't we? Why do we need to do an activity assessment? I already know it's radioactive. Well, the answer to that is the person receiving your radioactive waste is going to need an accurate activity information in order to be able to receive that waste. So the example on the slide here comes, I think, from the LLWR paperwork there. So you can see that they're asking for megabecquerels of a number of different isotopes there. So the screen capture here, I've just captured the total alpha isotopes. There are beta gammas going further along to the right hand side there. But for each individual isotope, they're going to want to know how many megabecquerels you've got in each of your packages. They're not going to take your waste if you just say, here you go, LLWR, my waste is radioactive. And part of the reason for that is this extract at the bottom here comes from, I think this is LLWR's, it's certainly somebody's permit, an extract from their permit. It's built into their permit, so it's built into law that they must have a written specification asking for the information that they need to be able to dispose of their waste there. So it's part of the law that you must provide this information, detailed information. The other statement that I've heard before that results in a similarly grumpy face is, but I already have a fingerprint. Why do I need to characterise my waste? Why do I need to do an activity assessment? I've already got a fingerprint. So we'll have a look now at what a fingerprint is and why simply having a fingerprint wouldn't be sufficient information to fill out all of that information that I showed previously. So this definition here at the top of the page comes from the Nuclear Industry Guidance on Clearance. So that's their definition on fingerprint. So you can see that a fingerprint is an estimate of the anticipated radionuclide mix. So it's talking about the mixture of radionuclides, what radionuclides you've got there, and how they relate to each other, what their proportions are in relation to each other. Why is a fingerprint useful? Well, what a fingerprint allows you to do is, as I say, you can relate one nuclide to another. So that means that you wouldn't have to measure every single nuclide that's present in your waste. So that results in you saving time and money because you don't need to perform as much analysis. You only need to measure the nuclides that are actually easy to measure, and then you can infer the other nuclides from the nuclides that you've measured. So the nuclide that's the easy to measure one from which you're inferring your others will be called the key nuclide. Which nuclide is your key nuclide will depend on a number of factors, what nuclides you've got in your waste and which ones are easily detectable, the main factors. So you've seen a textbook definition of what a fingerprint is, but I thought I'd try and really hammer home this message by bringing things back to basics, and I've made an analogy here. This is somebody who is quite familiar in our house, and I'm sure will be familiar in a number of other households that are watching today. This is Dougie, for those who are not familiar. Dougie, the dog, runs a daycare facility, and he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children of different animals. They attend his daycare every day. So we know that if we can see Dougie, because he's got a duty of care to look after these children, if it's during daycare hours, if we can see Dougie, we can infer the fact that there will likely be the other 5 kids close by to Dougie. So in this example, Dougie is our key nuclide. He's the one that we can measure. We can't measure the others, but we know from past experience that whenever we see him, we usually see those, and we usually see them in a 1-to-1. 1 of him equals 1 of each of the other kids. Or to make another example, now Dougie's hiding in the bush as well. If we can't see Dougie, but we can hear Rolly because he's very loud, Rolly in this instance would be our key nuclide. So he's the one that we can hear, and we're inferring based on past experience that if we can hear Rolly, Dougie's going to be close by, as are all of the other kids. And that is basically how fingerprints work. It's relating the other things that are present to the one that you can see or hear, or in the case of radiation, measure or detect. So because it's based on past experience, there's always going to be generalizations being made when we're talking about fingerprints. So I've tried to represent that below, where we've got Dougie and the kids inside drums. So you can see in this first drum, we've got the same mix as initially proposed. We've got 1 Dougie to each of the kids. In the next drum, now we've got 2 mice and 2 rhinos. In the next drum, 2 crocodiles and 2 hippos. So it's these 2 have different mixtures to what we would originally have proposed as our fingerprint, those 2 drums. But when we look at all 4 drums, so when we look at the waste stream as a whole, the ratio is still the same as what we initially proposed, but it's recognised that when you're using fingerprints, you're going to get the odd package here and there that doesn't match exactly with what your defined ratios are. So that's recognised within the industry that if you're using fingerprints, that's an artifact that you'll see. So yeah, by not measuring it every nuclide every time, you're introducing this risk that you might have variations from the fingerprint. But equally, if you were to collect samples from each of these drums, so say you said, right, we're not going to use a fingerprint to characterise all of these drums, we're going to actually use radiochemical sampling, and we're going to sample every single drum, you're still introducing risk using that method as well, because unless you've got a very well written sampling plan, which hopefully you will, but you know, you could just measure, your samples could be not representative of the entire drum, and you have a similar risk there that it's not representative. So before you actually come to use a fingerprint to describe your radioactive waste, you should always consider how it was derived and what purpose it was derived for. So as I've mentioned, we've got a couple of drums there that move away from what our originally defined fingerprint was. So you should think about what the implication of that is. If it were the case that the mouse had a lower limit that you were working to, then you might want to consider the possibility that you will have drums that will have twice as many of that nuclide in, and consider how you're defining your fingerprint and how much pessimism you're rolling into your fingerprint. So we've just discussed what fingerprints are and what the benefits of those are. So now we'll move on to the methods of activity assessment. So at Capenhurst, we tend to use one of three primary methods for activity assessment. Sampling and analysis, where we generate samples and send them off for radiochemical analysis. Assay using one of our high resolution gamma spectroscopy systems, and estimation based on handheld probe results. So there are other methods available, but these first three are the ones that I'm going to be talking about in turn today. Other methods, you can do estimates based on dose rate measurements, which I think I do touch on slightly in relation to the probe measurements. You could do passive or active neutron counting. Both of these methods aren't suitable for our waste on Capenhurst, which is why I'm not going to be discussing them in detail today, because it's not something that we do on a day-to-day basis. Calorimetry, suitable for high-level waste, and swab counting. We don't tend to use that a great deal for waste activity assessments, primarily because it only tells you about the loose activity, not about the total activity. So my argument would be that that's more useful for health physics surveys, where the loose contamination is posing a health hazard. I'm not saying it's not important for waste management, but it's not one of the primary methods that we use. And there are probably many other more modern or kind of bespoke techniques in addition to those. So how do you decide which method of activity assessment you're going to use? You have to use best available techniques, or if you're in Scotland, BPEO and BPM. Again, that's something that's not just a good idea. Of course, it is a good idea to use the best available technique, but again, that's written into your permit. So this is an extract from, I think this is from the URENCO nuclear stewardship permit probably. So it says that the operator shall use best available techniques to characterise, it's there in black and white, you have to use best available techniques to activity assess your waste. Which method is going to be the best will depend on a number of different factors, depend on the waste form, the waste volume, the contamination mechanism, how it's become contaminated. Also more practical factors like the availability of resources and equipment, turnaround times, the required level of accuracy for where you're going to be sending your waste, what you're going to be doing with it, anticipated activity levels, of course, conventional safety considerations, which might include the package size and how many movements you need to make of packages around the site, and a few other things as well. So if you've decided that sampling and analysis is your best method, then this technique should always begin with some systematic planning. At UNS, we follow the DQO methodology at the moment. Recently, I know a few sites have started moving away from DQO, and the low-level waste characterisation good practice guide proposes its own version of systematic planning. And I think Dounreay have moved towards that version of systematic planning as well. But whichever version of systematic planning you use, I would certainly recommend that you use a version of systematic planning, because that will drive you to think about how many samples are generated, what they're analysed for, and it'll ensure that you're making robust decisions and that they've been well documented, and that you basically think things through in a logical fashion. Following this technique, sampling should be optimised. That's part of the DQO, the idea of the DQO, where that's saying that you shouldn't take more samples than are necessary either. You want to take just the right amount of samples and analyse them for just the right things, so that you're not gathering more data than is needed, but enough data to be confident in your decisions to a pre-agreed level of confidence. So these are again some lessons learned. Once you have documented your very detailed and robust justification for your sampling plan, you must then also, of course, pass these detailed instructions on to the sampler. That can appear within your justification report, or it might appear in a completely different document. But unless you pass on these instructions in an appropriate fashion to the person generating the samples, then all of your clever thinking and preparation can be for naught. So yeah, there's a lesson learned. And a chain of custody wants to be generated as well, so that the information about where the sample's been taken from, when it was generated, this kind of thing gets passed down the line to the labs and subsequently into your analysis report. Picture of the dice there is because that often you might use statistics and random aspects in your sampling and analysis plan. So if you're doing sticking with sampling and analysis, when your lab report comes back with your results in, this is the next stage that you want to be following then, where again we follow the American data quality analysis methodology to systematically work through the results there. So rather than diving straight into your lab report with the results in, it's important that you make sure that you're asking the right questions of the data, questions that you were originally thinking of, or again document if the questions have changed since then, and follow a logical process to interpreting the report, and ensure that the data that's come back to you is appropriate to answer those questions that you're asking. Sometimes, well, often there's a gap in time between the initial planning and then the results coming back, so it's important that you remind yourself what the original intention was rather than diving straight in. Okay, so method number 2, high resolution gamma spectroscopy or spectrometry. There is a difference between the two definitions. There was a very good presentation, one of the SRP webinars a few months ago, about the principles of high resolution gamma spectroscopy. So I'd point you to go and look at that one for more detail into the fundamental physics behind it. But on a high level, what the aim is here is we're converting photons emitted by the waste, which present in this kind of visual fashion on the screen to the operator. We're turning that, your photons per second in energy channels, into ultimately a becquerels and activity measurement for your waste. So going from counts to activity. So you've got a number of different options for HRGS. You've got your mobile systems, of which these are just a couple of examples. These tend to be mechanically cooled to make them mobile and more portable. Advantages are you can take them to the workface, so you can measure your waste in situ before, for example, it even becomes waste while it's still there. Or equally, you can assay your waste at the workface once it's been packaged. But the benefits there meaning, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to transport your waste across site, so reducing conventional hazards by taking these mobile bits of kit closer to where the waste is being generated. Collimation is usually present, so that you're looking at the packages directly in front of you. But this kind of collimation attached around the detector head isn't foolproof, so it's still, these systems are still quite susceptible to background radiation fields in the area. You've got quite a lot of flexibility with these systems, because as you can see, there's nothing limiting you as to what you put in front of this bit of equipment. It could be a bag, it could be a large metal cylinder or a beam, it could be a drum. So you can assay many different geometries and materials with these systems, but the trade-off being there that you need somebody SQEP to provide that oversight to do the modelling of the items and analyse the spectra. So you've got a trade-off between flexibility and resource requirements, basically. They often require a stable power supply, and they can survive without being plugged into the mains on a battery, but the battery life is very variable across different manufacturers. So some of them you could comfortably operate for a working day on the battery. Others, the battery is simply there to protect the system if there's a brief loss of power. And a couple of examples you can see there, that's the Mirion Isox trolley, and that's the Ortec ISO cart. Very similar. Similar systems, but each not identical, and each have their different benefits. So other than the mobile HRGS, you've also got a static HRGS here. So this is a much, well, you can see it's not mobile. It's a much larger, heavier piece of kit. These could be mechanically cooled, or they could be liquid nitrogen cooled, but most sites are moving away from liquid nitrogen cooling because of the conventional safety aspects. They tend to have built-in shielding, where you can see this one's, well, I don't know if you can see, it's got shielding in this kind of cupboard arrangement here to reduce the contributions from the background. And these tend to output their results in a standard report format. And similarly have a built-in models and a user-friendly interface for the operators. So these three final points are the trade-off you get between the static and the mobile, where an operator can enter the, say, package type and expected fingerprint in a nice, easy fashion, and then he'll get a report out in his hand without any support required from the technical staff, basically. But because he's only got a limited options he can choose from, you've then lost, and because it's inside this shielding, you've lost that flexibility there with the different things that you can assay. So benefits to both systems. Often these systems may employ more than one detector. This one's got 3 on the side there. They may have built-in scales to weigh the waste for you. They might have a source built-in, radioactive source, that allows you to measure the density of the waste you're putting in front of it through the attenuation of the radiation coming from that built-in source. Systems like this may also have a conveyor belt built in to allow you to kind of queue up a number of drums, maybe about 5 or 6 drums, so that can then the system will be automated and operate itself and run through a number of drums without needing the operator to be there. They may just have a single detector that moves up and down the package, and that's how it sees all of the package rather than having multiple detectors. And these systems, depending on how you've set it up, may or may not also infer the other non-detectable nuclides from your fingerprint. So they may output a report with those in, or they may just report what it's detecting. A word of caution, lessons learnt. As I said, they generate these standard reports, but I would certainly recommend that before you interpret those reports, you have a briefing from somebody who's SQEP to interpret them. With the best will in the world, trying to make a easy to read, user-friendly report isn't foolproof. You only have so much space, no matter what system you're using. There's only so much space on an A4 page, and there's only so much text you can type in before people go word blind. So make sure that you understand the report that you're looking at. You know whether it's inferring extra nuclides it's not seen. You know what errors are being included in the report or not included, whether you need to include extra errors onto the results that are being output. Another word of caution, you only find what you look for. So this is true with the sampling as well. If you don't request a radionuclide to be analysed for, then of course you're not going to see it. And if you don't include a nuclide in your gamma spec library, even if that nuclide emits a gamma, if you've not programmed it into your system, you're not going to find it. So again, you need to know what you're looking for. You could have a library with loads of nuclides in if you want, but that's another conversation. But yeah, just a word of warning that if you don't look for it, you won't see it. Look out for nuclides. This is probably treated in that previous webinar. Nuclides that emit similar energies, the systems can still have difficulty in resolving them, which can cause issues. What's that here? If a nuclide is in your waste but isn't in your fingerprint, yeah, the same applies as above. So if it's a non-gamma so you're not detecting it, but also if you've not included it in your fingerprint and it's there, then it's not going to get followed through into the following paperwork, which is why history and provenance are so important in making sure that you're applying the correct fingerprint to your waste so that you're not missing anything. Final method now, probe surveys. So if we go back to first principles, because that's where we need to start, your probe will have been designed to detect preferentially a certain type of radiation. So initially I had said your probe will be able to detect one type of radiation, but then I've amended that slightly to remember that although it is preferentially detecting one type of radiation, it may well pick up the other types that you're not specifically looking for. For example, like crosstalk on a dual probe between the alpha and beta output there, for example. But if we imagine, for the sake of argument, it's detecting whatever radiation type it's looking for. So what you need to do is convert the amount of counts that your detector is seeing on your readout into becquerels on your item or in your waste. That's what we're aiming for. So we remember that alphas are very easily attenuated by water or grime on the surface of your object. So alphas are pretty much, as far as I'm concerned, a no-go for calculating the activity of your waste using probe surveys. Betas can be okay for surface contamination situations because we can apply factors into our calculations to account for how much it's been attenuated by various surface conditions like grime or the surface roughness of the object and that kind of thing. However, if it's a volume source, then the betas aren't going to make it to the outside of your package. And well, I think there's another image coming up in a minute. Gammas, as I've said, we've got those gamma spec assay systems. So if you've got a gamma emitting waste, we would tend to use the HRGS. But there are some situations where you might want to use a gamma probe rather than the HRGS systems. Not that many spring to mind, but often to do with accessibility and whether the accessibility of getting to the contamination. So as I said, we want to convert counts to becquerels. So that's going to be influenced by whether the surface or the item is grimy, oily, wet, dusty, surface coatings like that. The material itself, what's it made out of? How easily can the emissions make it out of that type of material? The condition of the surface, if you're doing beta probe measurements, so is the surface nice and smooth, or is it old and scuffed and damaged and rusty? Oh no, rust, I've got another one. Yeah. Distance from the detector to the item. Also remembering to think about the geometry of the item. So if the item's got a curved edge, then some of the parts of that edge are going to be further away than the rest of it. So distance from the detector accounting for geometry as well. Efficiency of the detector in detecting the radiation that you're looking for and at that particular energy. Location or distribution of the contamination. Have you got it in discrete areas, or is the contamination spread throughout, for example? And also your background count rate in the area is also going to influence how many counts per second you're seeing. So again, this is another one of the aspects that I wanted to hammer home a little bit more with the diagram. Specifically because a couple of times at the clearance and exemption working group, we've had discussions about how in the past problems have arisen, events. I'm not sure if events have actually happened or if it's been near misses that have happened. I have to delve into the depths of my memory, but where if you lose provenance on your item and you make the wrong decision between whether your item is surface contaminated or whether the contamination is spread throughout the bulk of the material, If you don't know the answer to that, you make the wrong decision on that, whether it's bulk or surface, then you can end up choosing the wrong activity assessment method or the wrong parameters, and incorrectly coming up with incorrect activity assessments then. So to try and show again what we were saying yesterday about the alphas and the different emission types. So those little red arrows there are representing alpha particles trying to escape from the surface of this, imagine a cube of radioactive waste where the contamination is spread throughout the bulk of that cube. So the alphas will make it out from the surface, and that's about it. The betas, if they're emitted from the centre of the package, I've done those in pale blue, trying to visualise there if they're actually in the bulk of the material. Those two betas there, they're not going to make it to the outside of your radioactive material and be detected. They'll be attenuated by the material itself before they actually make their way out. Whereas these two darker blue ones, I've tried to demonstrate if they're on towards the surface of the package, they're going to be able to make their way out and you'll be able to detect them. So you need to know what your situation is, whether you've got some distributed throughout the bulk that are not making it out or not. And as we've said with the gammas, if your gamma's emitted even from the centre of the package, it will be attenuated by the material, but some amount of those gammas are likely going to make their way out of the material to be detected by your detection system, which at this point as well I've drawn further away from your package. The gammas are going to, so your gamma detection equipment doesn't need to be in direct contact with your package. You can have it standing off a little bit. So yeah, the importance of knowing whether you've got surface contamination or bulk contamination there. When converting from dose rates to becquerels, similar basic principles apply that you need to think about the condition of your material and these kind of things. And when performing these calculations in going from dose rates to becquerels, the methods vary in complexity significantly. So an old-fashioned technique that I've used in the past, the Dawson technique, you simply take your dose rate as measured and multiply it by a conversion factor. So it's just basic maths you can do with a biro and a piece of paper there, all the way up to using specialist modelling softwares such as MCMP or Attila there, where you're predicting and you're modelling every single photon that's emitted from your material and all of the aspects of what it's contained in and such like, to come up with a very detailed model of the situation there. And it brings us back round to fingerprint derivation and discussions as well, where again, when you're doing this modelling in MCMP or Attila, you need a source term. The term is there when you're describing radionuclide splits for shielding. So again, it's thinking about how that source term or how that fingerprint, you know, there's a difference between source terms and fingerprints, but again, thinking about how you are deciding relationships between different activities, different nuclides. A talk about activity assessment wouldn't be complete without at least mention of maximum miscible activity, but I think Pete Burgess covered this in his talk a couple of weeks ago. But again, another point to hammer home, that when it comes to activity assessment of radioactive waste, especially when you're, well, particularly when you're trying to demonstrate that your waste is out of scope of the permitting regs, it's not sufficient to just say that I've detected nothing and therefore there's no activity there. That's not robust enough. You must demonstrate that in detecting nothing above background, or in detecting nothing, that really does mean that the activity that is present is less than the out of scope limits or any other limit that you're working to. So that's where maximum miscible activity comes in. So it defines the maximum amount of activity that could be there that you could have missed that you're not detecting. And if you want, as I said, if you want more detail on maximum admissible activity, you can see Pete Berger's webinar and also Appendix B of the clearance and exemption good practice guide, which is this one here. So it's not called good practice guide, it's called a nuclear industry guide too. So yeah, if you want more information on activity assessment of waste or characterisation of radioactive waste in general, you've got the solid radioactive waste characterisation good practice guide there. I don't agree with every single thing in that document, but it's a good comprehensive guide. This one we've mentioned about, that's all about clearance and exemption. And there's one there from MPL as well about radiometric non-destructive assay. That's another good, pretty heavy read. So we've talked about why you need to know the activity and how not to make Stephanie grumpy. We've talked about 3 different methods of activity assessment in detail. And we've talked about remembering the fundamental physics of the situation, what's going on, and the importance of history and provenance in the activity assessment of radioactive waste. There you go. Any more questions that you don't want to ask now, you can email here. Yep, and there's all the other contact details.